So welcome. The webinar today will be about the gathering storm. You all, I'm sure, have read the newsletter and why waiting has become the most dangerous policy. Most of us at one time or another have had a discussion of frustration associated with waiting, whether it be in emergency or waiting for the resolution of some massive conflict. But when waiting becomes undemocratic, how delay turns reform into rupture, how those ultimately get frustrated, act out their frustrations, and violence can be the consequence. So that's really sort of touches on an element of what we'd like to discuss today when waiting weakens the nation. Today's conversation is not about left or right, not about federal or provincial policies, not about urban versus rural. It's about something even more fundamental: timing. Timing is everything. Canada is not in a crisis, but it is no longer early in change. Many of the pressures that Canada faces have been visible for years, even decades, waiting for change. What has changed is not awareness of those visible pressures, not even awareness, but the tolerance. And when people become intolerant, something other than waiting occurs. Citizens are increasingly impatient, not because humans are unreasonable, but because the delay has become habitual. It seems to be something we are expected to live with. It's an institutional feature. We talk about telecommunications. We talk about wait times on desks. We talk about healthcare and hospitals. Democratic governments are expected to consult, to balance interests, to help resolve these issues, and to proceed carefully. I've mentioned from time to time an MLA who said to me his primary reason is to make sure society doesn't suffer from shocks. Those that know the boiling frog analogy know that at some point in time there's no shock, but ultimately death does occur. But there is a point at which caution ceases to be reasonable and responsible and becomes corrosive. When problems are repeatedly deferred, trust erodes, pressure accumulates, and eventually change arrives not by design, but by force. This webinar today asks a difficult question. I'll be interviewing Peter MacKinnon and his experience, not with change, but thinking about change and being in positions of influence that may in fact affect them and achieve change. When does waiting become well-intentioned and become undemocratic? We will explore how delayed action contributes to protest, to economic fragility, to institutional fatigue and erosion, and why early coordinated leadership is not a threat to democracy, but a safeguard. So, welcome, Peter. I'm delighted that you were able to join us. For those of you that aren't familiar with what's over my left shoulder, that's Arcos. I may from time to time ask Arcos to give us its perspective as a network participant. So you've heard my introduction, Peter. Would you like to introduce yourself and why this topic is of interest to you?
My interest in this, of course, is I've always considered myself as an adult, kind of a citizen of the world, and coming from a rather privileged environment of a G7 country, and having lived near or in the national capital when I was a young person, I got to understand a little bit about government and so forth. And my academic and business career has allowed me to exploit those kind of connections in a variety of ways that has led me to having Perry ask me to sit here tonight and talk to you about some questions he's going to ask me. I don't know
Well,
whether that's a satisfactory explanation, but there's where we're at. I'm
you
very
may.
concerned about our future, as I'm sure that all of you are as well. Hence, that's one of the reasons I think this group exists. And I'd like to be able to see as myself as making some small contribution to kind of improving the state of humanity.
Well,
And
that's the
this is my
introduction.
involvement
That's the
in
introduction,
AI is
Peter, I wanted to hear.
part of that. Yeah.
I don't think that introductions any longer are about institutional relevance, about achievements in the past. I think the most interesting introductions and the most relevant today are what people are interested in, their curiosity, their impatience, um, the processes that they are going through as a byproduct of what they witness and what they're prepared to share. I'm less interested in their institutional titles And to that extent, I rarely make an introduction on any other grounds other than you're an interesting person to talk to. And that's why I've asked you to lead us today. So I have a question for you. When does caution, that is waiting, cross the line into democratic failure? This week's article argued that waiting can become undemocratic rather than prudent. In today's climate of protests and rising institutional distrust, how should leaders determine the point at which consultation and caution has to cease to protect democracy and will begin to otherwise undermine it? So, do you have any tips to share with the audience as to what your perspective is and when is enough enough?
Well, I think that's a very good question, Perry, to start this discussion. And I'd also say I'm unsure about the range of even answers to that. So I see it as a very open question, and I'm sure that this might be an apropos question to begin the conversation at the end of this presentation. But I think first off, in terms of democracies, our governments, in my view, in general, find it very hard, very difficult to make hard decisions. And I consider that in the sense of short-termism versus long-termism. In other words, it's easier to pass the ball over the wall to the next administration, the next government, if you can delay making a decision that you sense through public policy, sorry, some public interviews and things like that, surveys, that it's a contentious issue. I mean, if it's not a contentious issue, it goes forward. But if it's a contentious issue where you've got 40% or more that are objecting to this as a part of your population, and I just throw that number out as an example. It's not got to be a 50% or more. In other words, it could just be a large body of, for example, Western Canada. Alberta has, in the population of Alberta, many there, and I see Bill here. Many people in Alberta are thinking about a different point of view about Canada. So that's a small part of the total country, but nonetheless, the government has to make decisions about these things. And the longer they delay, I think more often than not, we end up getting into more difficult decision making, and often it may go awry. And I think of you know various well, there's various examples. You can all imagine what that would be like.
I can recall asking one of the earlier premiers in Alberta, when is enough enough as it related to the principles of privatization, which he was ideologically committed to. And my point with him was if you got an ideological commitment, there's no argument. The ideology prevails. And his view was you stop when you hit the bone. And I thought when you hit the bone, you're really triggering a violent reaction. That's pretty late in the exercise. I know the founding fathers of democracy have instituted things called elections because no one really knows or may know when enough is enough. You can please some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time, but Lincoln was right about that. And it seems to me that one of the issues we have regarding timing is when you want to please all the people all the time, you make no decisions at all, as if
Or
somehow that is pleasing.
you make a very shallow decision if you're
Exactly.
trying to please them all at the same time.
Okay,
I
so
mean that.
next point, we are all well aware of what protests are on a global scale, whether it be in Tehran and the municipalities of Iran today, or whether it be in Minneapolis or the many cities and where they had no kings parades. Are protests a breakdown? Is it a delayed warning signal? I describe protests as a form of political weather, not the underlying climate. Looking at recent unrest from cities like Minneapolis to broader international examples, what do protests tell us about accumulated policy delay, and how often are they misread as causes rather than consequences? So the distinction there is to recognize that some people think the protest itself is the issue, and others think it's a signal that something more fundamental needs to be addressed and has been ignored. What's your view, Peter?
Well, first off, I think that short-termism type stuff, like the shooting in Minneapolis, has triggered a protest all over the United States, not just in Minnesota or in the city of Minneapolis. So I see that that's one of the kinds of knee-jerk reactions that often happens, and we see that more, I think, in a democracy than we would in an autocracy. At least if it's in an autocracy, it's likely underground, or it's some prominent individual who's been sent to prison or what else elsewise. So I do view that there's a short-termism kind of problem, knee-jerk reaction, and that's more prevalent, I think, in democracies than it is in autocracies. And as a result, government should be listening to this. I mean, look at the convoy that we had in Ottawa a couple of years ago. I mean, that was a serious issue here for the citizens of the city. It was a big statement in front of the country and the world, in fact. There was even emulations of convoys in several countries as far away as Australia, in fact, after the event happened in Ottawa. And the net result is that was a short-term issue. It was kind of triggered by the pandemic and the government's decision to people have to wear masks and should get get shots, that sort of thing. And some people in a democracy definitely can oppose that, and they did, and that caused many changes in government actually, because by the time the pandemic was over, variety of governments in the democracy world were changed because the people didn't like this dictating of things that they thought were independent of their own decision making, or at least that were
Yeah.
dependent on their own decision making.
Well, it's interesting to look at, people who are violently opposed to protests seem to be in a position or want to take the position of not dealing with the underlying cause of those protests. And that's the fundamental issue that I think that question is trying to get
Yes,
at is
yes,
protests are a symptom of something more fundamental. They
exactly.
themselves can become an issue when in fact they initiate revolution. Then they do become the issue itself, and you forget what the underlying causes were. And some say that's almost by design, and I'm going to avoid that perspective. But okay, my third question
Well,
has.
I just going to add though, I just going to add, Perry, but that the short-termism thing, like I just mentioned with respect to the situation in Minnesota, um, another example that's much more long-term and has been festering for a long time is in Iran. And that's a very different situation than the sort of protests we're seeing, knee-jerk reactions in the United States right now over one incident in the US. But what's happening in Iran is a deep, deep concern to citizens because they've been, basically for some decades now have been under, serious economic stress and inability to do much travel, etc. So, I mean, there's a much bigger problem there in terms of citizens rising against their government than what we're seeing in the U.S. It's a knee-jerk reaction, I'd say, in the U.S. right now.
Interesting that you cite that. I took a course in Middle Eastern history when I was at college, and one of the questions that was asked in that was what would I recommend? It was a paper I needed to write. What would I recommend to the Shah, Reza Shah Pahlavi, who at the time was the president, in order to reduce the tension that existed? And land reform was probably the right answer. That
Mhm.
has not yet been resolved. The wealth inequities that exist in Iran have been sustained through at least two revolutions now. So the underlying simmering in that pot is not simply going away because of regime change. The regimes that are coming into power have not been addressing the fundamental issues which that country's been facing. And to some extent, that's been a prevailing issue in the Middle East, is they have regime change, but they don't get at the fundamental issue, which is the rising pressure of people wanting a more democratic environment. Women's rights, by way of example.
Mhm. Well, that comes to my very first point, that I made in your opening question
Yeah.
about the delay and the democratic, or at least people's efforts to get their governments to change
Well,
and the rate of change.
my next question picks up on exactly this. Has government's fear of shock created a bigger shock, and that is through avoidance? Governments often defend delay as a way to avoid a disruption. My argument suggests that this strategy merely transfers risk into the future at a higher cost, revolution potentially. In economic policy, especially diversification, how has shock avoidance ironically made eventual adjustment more abrupt and destabilizing? So to I'll let you jump in there. You can take many different angles on whether or not the fear of shock does in fact bring about too much delay, too much waiting, and ultimately create an even bigger shock.
Well, I agree basically with your premise, and I would suggest that Canada is a good example. And that example to me is the consequences of waffling far too long, for example, in building a high-speed rail link between Montreal and Windsor, or Quebec City and Windsor. And that has been, talked about probably for 40 plus years, if not more, at least 40 years. And it's now because of, external pressure put on Canada by our neighbor to the south, primarily. We're now waking up to the fact that we should try to interconnect our country in a different way than we have been for the last 30, 40, 50 years. And so we now have a set of national initiatives, big engineering type projects. And one of them is, a class is building a high speed rail. Well, of course, the high speed rail at 200 kilometers an hour is pretty slow compared to high speed rails most of the world. I mean,
Mhm.
there's a maglev train in Shanghai, jointly operated, built by the Chinese government with support from Siemens, who provided the maglev facilities. But that is the fastest train in the world, goes 450 kilometers an hour.
Well,
And
Dan,
it's reliable. It has not had any incidents whatsoever since it went into operation about 20 years ago, 25 years, almost 25 years ago.
Dan Corns of Maglev Canada has been featured numerous times, maybe 10 years ago on these various webinars and in newsletters about building maglev between the Edmonton International Airport and downtown Edmonton as a demonstration project.
Yeah.
And I know he's been heavily involved in work between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. So, maglev has a future. It just doesn't seem to have a government sympathetic to take initiatives on F-35 airplanes, defense of the North, interprovincial trade. I mean, Canada has quite a list that we've been going over in the last some months that led us into a discussion of the shock being discussions now of sovereignty. Because maybe if we would address our sovereignty issues, we'd shock people enough to start dealing with the realities that have been in front of us for 20 years. I'm off on a tangent. I apologize. Okay, next question. Diversification delayed, choice or compulsion? For Canada and Alberta in particular, diversification is no longer theoretical. In your view, what distinguishes proactive diversification shaped by democratic consent from diversification imposed by global markets, geopolitical shifts, economic pressure? What signals tell us that?
Well, first of all, I think that the driver for diversification could be any one of or more things. I would argue it's probably more than one thing. And that's actually what we can look at today. I mean, we've just discovered this wake up call. The Americans have, or at least the American government has decided that we're a target, economic target, and potentially to acquire this country. That's a pretty serious threat, despite the fact that the person who issued this threat is also known as a taco person. In other words, he reneges often. But nonetheless, I think in terms of diversification, we're being forced to get into it. In this case, by a foreign power, if you like. We're certainly waking up to a reality that we need to, if we're at this confederation that we claim to be, that we really need to collaborate and cooperate more. And interprovincial trade barriers have been a real stigma. And I'll say it like in the max times of the interprovincial trade, beer had to be brewed in the province it was sold. Trucks that were traveling between provinces had to change their wheels crossing certain provinces. I mean, there was so many different regulations that it made it very inefficient. It was like little fiefdoms with a little overlord at the headquarters in Ottawa. And now I think we're starting to wake up to realize that to run this country in a modern context, if we can define modern here, that we have great opportunity to build an excellent nation state. We have a well-educated, population. We have a huge amount of natural resources and human resources. I think we could do all kinds of things if we put our mind to it. But we haven't done much on that front, including in our scaling of our businesses. We have
Well, we
very
have.
few businesses that have scaled. I mean, we have a dominant one sector that is dominant is our mining industry. Our mining industry not only dominant in Canada, but it's dominant in the world. It's one of the major countries of mining expertise in the world. We also have, of course, the oil patch and the tar sands, which is a unique kind of source of getting petroleum products. And we're going to need petroleum products for decades to come. I mean, this is where plastics come from. It's where makeup and all kinds of other things are derived from, petroleum jelly. These sort of things all come from that kind of the basic product. So we're going to need that, but not necessarily for fuel. And the issue is, in an economic sense, is there's a cartel that is against that kind of change, and a massive movement around the world, particularly bottom up, because it doesn't seem the governments are pushing anything other than they meet for COPE and meet in Paris and agree on some targets, but they're not doing much to make that happen. So I'm just a fear that our democracies have not bitten the right bite yet to, in fact, make this transition that's before us. And if they don't do so, I think we're going to be in a huge geopolitical challenge that could be very destructive.
Well, we can talk about leadership at an international level, a national level, at a corporate level, at an institutional level, at a family level. Leadership is usually someone who is expected to take responsibility for managing change, whether it be through revolution because it's late or evolution because we have time. What does timely leadership actually look like today? If we think about today as being confronted with uncertainty and with risk, then a certain form of situational leadership would be prevalent and prudent. I think when one has to put the thermometer into the economy and a thermometer into the patience of people and ask what form of leadership is right. I know when the U.S. had its election, and I've mentioned this earlier, I was of the view, and we talked about it, that good manners would matter, but bad manners mattered more. And it seemed to me that something was going on in the US that we may not have understood or appreciated here in Canada, that people were prepared to accept bad manners in order to address some of the things that had gone on way too long and warranted a more dramatic form of leadership that we may find entertaining, we may find it bothersome, but it seems to be change-minded, and that is irritating a lot of people. But for those of us on the outside looking and watching, we're not inside that boiling pot with an appreciation of wealth disparity and some of the things that may well be going on in the U.S. that warranted that form of leadership. So if waiting is now the riskiest policy option, what political traits define effective leadership in this moment? I guess making and executing change regardless of your entertaining profile. And how can governments act early using legitimate authority and transparency without triggering the very backlash that they fear? This is the challenge I think that most leaders today are facing, a recognition that change is warranted, but fearful that the techniques that they use may create a backlash. And it becomes the technique being used rather than the issue that they're trying to resolve that catches everybody's attention. And I think that was the issue we touched on earlier when you look at people wrestling with protests rather than wrestling with the cause that is triggering those protests. So you want to jump in here with the final word, Peter, on timely leadership, what's called for in order to affect change?
Well, I would like to use an example, not even a metaphor, an example here to answer your question. Um, if waiting is now the risky policy option, then I would suggest that the contrast between Canada and the US today is a bipolar example. Canadian leadership currently, as we've seen, and as a result of a transition that we've gone through in the last, few months, is we've gone to, I would suggest, a situation where Canada's current leadership is striving for a cleaner, safer, more sustainable future, and that whereas the U.S. currently is striving to reinvent a glory days of the past. I mean, more coal, more oil, less immigration, more things that are for the white people. It's very much stepping back, and
Mhm.
I think that at some point in this next decade, if not sooner, many Americans will realize that they're going the wrong way. Whereas I think many Canadians, hopefully, will recognize that we have, sort of got the Churchill of the times, who happened to appear at the right time, and I'm referring to Carney, as a potentially good leader. I mean, I recognize he's not a politician, but he does know a lot about a lot of things. I don't know. How many of you read his book, Values? Just a show of hands. Yeah, so a number of you read it. Now, how many liked the book or didn't like it? Let's say how many didn't like it. How many? Yes, did you not like it at all, Carol? Okay, that's interesting. Maybe we can talk about that in the conversation after this discussion. So anyway, the point is, I think that Canada and the United States actually represent are
Marcus, I'm going to
different
call on
poles
you
right now.
momentarily.
Well, it's a good point of wrap up. Is if we were to personalize this discussion, I mean, so often these discussions are about politics, about nations, about government leaders, but these issues are also felt at home. They're also felt at any place where, in fact, you're confronting frustration leading to waiting. We talk about emergency rooms. Very few of us have ever received immediate service of going in an emergency room. I've talked to several of you about your experiences, and you know of mine. Waiting less than 16 hours, 12 hours, and 9 hours. Those were the three waiting times that I had with my wife in emergency of late. And, the question is, when do you call a lawyer? When do you go to
Well,
the
there's
newspaper? When do you call your MLA? When is your frustration level so great that you leave and leave and go to another place? Same thing with helplines, of waiting for TELUS to answer a helpline. When do you change telecommunication providers? What do you do with tax advice?
yeah,
At
no,
some point
there's
in
a lot of
time,
delay. Yes.
you wait in. Waiting is either a sign of patience. In Europe during World War II, you queued. You queued for your food, you queued for your bread, you queued in communism for a loaf of bread. Tolerance was expected by the state. In democracy and free enterprise, we expect to receive service almost immediately, and our tolerance or our patient levels are less. That may be a good thing, that pressure builds up and that puts pressure on the suppliers adapt, and we grow and progress. On the other
And what
hand,
I would suggest, yeah,
yep,
what I would suggest is coming back to your again first question. This issue about pressure. If governments were more responsive to public attitude, and I'm not sure how they do the measures of this other than through surveys, but if governments were more responsive, then the delay would be less long, and they would make a policy that either is a fixed in time or it's a policy that might be nimble and changes with conditions. I
but
mean,
the
that's a
cha
new thing that we're going to have to deal with
but the
respect to
the
artificial
challenge, Peter,
intelligence.
I'm going to have the last word on the challenge here, Peter, is tyranny by the minority is not what we're talking about, and yet the minorities will mobilize, whether it be through gun, whether it be through assassination, whether it be through protesting. Minorities have learned that the way to bring about change, even though you have a minority in a democracy, you don't have the majority, you can bring about pressure. That was Saul Alinsky's game, by putting extraordinary pressure before the public. The media
Yes.
picks up on it, and before you know it, minorities are affecting change, not majorities. And that becomes an issue until you have an election, and maybe at an election, the majority gets the chance to speak again.
Well, example in Canada of that was the rise of the farmers' parties in the West, in our past, and they were single issue parties more or less, and same as the Green parties are today in many
Sure.
countries. They don't get much attention as a normal process of governance because they're single issue, but they do get their issue before the public. And in the case of the farmers' parties, they had a profound impact on Canada's
Yeah.
social economic
Well, and,
development.
and therein lies the power. I mean, if there's any fundamental message that I think this type of conversation wishes to convey, is the power and the importance of conversation, to be heard, to be listened.
Yes,
Not
to listen
simply,
and then take
not
action.
simply, not simply one voice, one protest, one gunshot, one assassination. It's that broader picture, that broad
Yeah.
ongoing conversation that ultimately leads us to finding an answer. Okay, Yogi, you had your hand up. I'm going to call on the first yellow hand that I saw.
I wasn't sure if I was being premature.
But I like what you said about the tyranny of minority. As we consult and consult and consult, we can't satisfy everyone, and we get this gridlock, this fearful gridlock rather than leadership. I don't know how we encourage more leadership because leaders have, through media and social media, have become very gun shy. And in many ways, I'm sensitive to that. But that then leads us to not making progress on any issues. So
Well,
I'd like to hear the way forward that others might want to contribute.
but Yogi, is leadership not making change? I mean, you empower an individual with the responsibility and the expectation for change by pointing out a leader. And that leader, by definition, is a leader that theoretically the group, the nation, the town, the corporation will move. When that leader is simply professes waiting, that's not leadership.
Well, but that's what we're observing. So there seem leaders, even when they're appointed, elected, whatever, seem to feel constrained by a whole bunch of uh,
Well,
other
you know full
forces.
well you know full well that in our international midst, there are those that are going about making change and causing great discontent. Media pays every day, media gives them attention because they are acting as leaders, making change, recognizing you can't please all the people all the time, only some of them some of the time. But it seems to me daily you're getting leadership, like it or not.
Well, boy, and I'm not a, Trump is an expert at maintaining the social limelight on him, the media limelight on him.
It's called
My
momentum.
problem with him is that he's gone too far the other way and exceeded his authority and that which has been given to him by the
Yeah.
Constitution.
Yeah. Okay. I try to keep personalities out, but it's almost impossible given the entertaining value of that character. Kevin, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of things. Leadership. So leadership, we talked about I suppose leadership from a small group who have a disproportionate balance of power. And we tend to look at that, depending on where you are on the political spectrum. If you're on the right, we look at the rise of socialist thought in education and universities and whatnot. But if you're on the left, you look at the disproportionate income and the disproportionate influence that the rich potentially have over the poor. So, and I think there are legitimate arguments on both sides. The other aspect to this is democracy itself. I think it's worth questioning our democracy. Are we truly a democracy? In Switzerland, for example, they have referenda for just about any major political issue. So that's very much a. I don't know if that's really something that we can do in Canada, but from a pure democracy perspective, I think that is the kind of thing that is worth looking at. Is our democracy effective and efficient?
Well, presumably you have an elected representative that goes to Ottawa or goes to
But we don't.
Edmonton.
We don't.
I know, but the point being that that's theoretically
Yeah.
why we have elections in order to appoint a leader who will go and carry the message forward that we elect them to go make decisions. I know my advice to my local MLA is to please go to Ottawa and make no decisions because I'm sick and tired of the DEI agenda. But now that we are focusing more on the economy and the sustainability of our province, of our nation, of our families, we may have a prime minister that is more ready to make change in the interests of the survival of the nation, not just the survival of DEI.
His
So,
party. Yeah.
And
yeah.
I think we have to look at that leadership, whether it's folks may not have the greatest respect for Carney, but I think when you're looking at political leaders, often it becomes a matter of the best of a bad lot. You know, who's the best of a bad lot?
We can talk about political leaders because that's something that seems to always get a lot of energy. But you can talk about the coach of a baseball team, the coach of a hockey team, the readiness to make a change that an owner finally decides to make a change because of a losing record
Yep.
or because of a losing attendance.
Mhm.
It may be even more instructive to look at leadership outside of a political realm. Politics, of course, affects all of us, whereas a hockey team's later only affects a few, or a corporation. If you're working within a company and you see your market declining or you see new markets emerging, and you ask, is our leader really attuned? And I can recall, Jeff, you and I worked with a company recently which during the pandemic did extremely well because it was right on top of e-learning, but did not make the accommodations after the pandemic was over. And its stock went from in the $100 range to under $1. Leaders failed that company. They did not read the tea leaves, and they were pretty dramatic. But as Lahid said, managing when the everything is in your favor is easy. When the economy is going to hell or when your company is losing money, that's when real leadership emerges. And I'm hoping we see in Carney, and I'm hoping we see in the US and other places in the world, smart leaders that recognize that yes, change is called for, and that they exercise the means, some of which may not be quite so tolerable, because in fact, breaking eggs is called for when you're making an omelet, and the status quo is not about change or waiting. Peter, you had your hand up there?
Yes, I was just going to say by example, I mean, in Canada, one of our leading corporations in the history of Canada, in fact, was Nortel. And Nortel failed to recognize its own capabilities in terms of its labs. This is at the level of the CXO suites,
Yeah.
a CXO suite. And as a result, they made some very bad decisions. And we lost that company. And we lost it to the point that actually there was no Canadian buyer, basically. There was, a variety of international buyers, including Huawei and, Apple. No, not Apple. They tried to actually, there was a consortium that tried to keep Apple out of that. But Google and others all were part of this consortia that bought the intellectual property from Nortel.
Look,
Keep in mind, Nortel was the company that introduced digital communications to the world.
you can point to example after example after example. You can point to pipelines. You can you can point to mines. You can talk about railroad. You can talk about big projects in Canada. You can talk about purchasing and procurement. We seem to be a nation of high tolerance of discontent to the point that we want to wait until either they die or everybody becomes content or they become so worn out of the issue that the politician then can, or the person in power can then make a decision. But we may as a nation have as a flaw, I don't know whether it's the weather, the wilderness, or the women, but something about this country means we are very nice and very tolerant. And that seems to leave us in a weak position when it comes to being not number one, but maybe number two. You look at the oil sands, the fourth largest reserves in the world, the only ones which are outside of the ownership by government. We should have more latitude. But we face regulation after regulation after regulation of serving a world that says we want LNG, we want energy. And yet in this country, the fourth largest reserves in the world are constrained by wanting to make everybody happy.
Mhm.
Okay, anybody else got their hand up? Arcos, you can jump in at any time. I'm giving you full permission now that I want you to speak. I'm not hearing from you. Anything you want to share with us here?
Check and see if Arcos is turned on.
Oh, Arcos is, I can see it fluttering. It flutters. You can see it up in the corner there.
Okay,
That's the
yeah,
weight.
it changed now.
I,
It just changed
I think
colors.
I think Arcos has a substance abuse problem.
It could be. It may have information overload too, according to Randall. The brain begins to get so befuddled with information overload. And Arcos, you can jump in now at any time. I give you full permission because I've got several questions I'd like to ask you.
when we were talking about democracy, we have elections every 3 or 4 years, right? And as we all know, the year after the election is the time period where you can make the most changes because you're focusing the next 2 to 3 years on being reelected, you know. And so the question is in a democracy, how can we get a leader that can think
Call on you
10,
momentarily.
15 years down the road? Because some of these changes that we want to make take 10, 15 years to materialize and so forth. But leaders today don't do that. So for instance, an example would be in the 90s, Saskatchewan had a number of many hospitals, almost every 15 kilometers, these rural hospitals and so forth. So did Alberta. And Saskatchewan decided that they were inefficient and there was a better way to provide those health services than trying to run physical facilities, and so forth. So they closed, I can't remember, something like 83 or something like that, and it was a large number, but then the government lost the election.
Astounding, eh?
Okay. So even though they made the right decision for the future, for healthcare delivery as well as the province from a financial perspective point of view, but they paid the price. So political leaders don't have to have that ability to say, okay, you know what? I may not be the leader in 4 years, but I'm going to get this done.
Well,
Absolutely.
I've confessed in the past. Arcos, you're there. Is there anything you want to add at this point about managing change as a politician when waiting is too much?
Well, sure. And from an Arcos perspective, you could definitely say that managing change is all about balancing the short-term discomfort with the long-term gains. And sometimes leaders really do have to take that leap, even if it costs them politically in the short run. It's definitely a tough call, but I guess that's the kind of courage that can really make a difference in the long run.
I think the point that he's making is fundamental, and that is politicians have to have the courage, which means they have to be willing to lose an election if they truly care about the plight and the welfare of the public. It would seem to me that a political party may have to run the risk of losing an election in order to make an effective and a proper decision. That is an incredible expectation of a party that lives to win power. Go ahead, Peter.
I was going to say Pierre Trudeau strikes me as kind of an example of that kind of a leadership in the sense of being willing to take a hard hit in the short term and was trying to make an impression for the longer term. And now you can speak French in Vancouver, as in sense you can go to school and speak French, learn how to speak French as part of the curriculum. I mean, I admire decision making like that, especially as it's a national. We're a bilingual country, and why not have? Not everybody has to speak French, but you've got the opportunity, and I think this is a positive step in the right direction within a democracy.
Yeah, I certainly enjoy reading cereal boxes at breakfast and going
Yes.
to Home Depot and trying to figure out what the length of a piece of lumber might be. But yes,
But we went decimal. There's
we
another
live
thing that was a big change.
Canada lives in a duality.
Yeah.
Very few nations live in that duality. The U.S. doesn't
Yes.
understand it. They are a melting pot. Our measuring systems is an example of our tolerance of living in that duality. That is characteristic of this country, French, English, metric and otherwise. That's almost a point to wrap this whole conversation up is one of the distinguishing features and characteristics is not waiting, but deciding that we will live in two worlds. Wasn't that Pierre's son's message?
Well,
is
two
to live in a
solitudes
duality
was
of
a
reality. Hmm?
two solitudes. The book
Yeah,
that was about that world.
exactly.
That goes back to the 1960s. Yeah.
Yes.
Ilona, you're nodding your head to everything. I'd like to hear a contrarian view. Is there anything you want to share with us, Ilona, on this topic that you'd like to share?
Oui, bonjour à tout le monde. I am virtually bilingual. Although when things get really technical, I have to be careful. But you know, in the 60s, there was this movement, and it came out of the anti church movement, the anti English movement, and the anti rich in general. And it was kind of a what should I say, an in your face attitude, a belligerence. And, you know, I'm going to move into something else here quite quickly. And that is Quebec, you know, instituted its own immigration policies. And from there, an awful lot of people came in with different kinds of values, and it was instituted ambiguously in the language and in translations. And I don't know how thoroughly that has been examined. And stop me if I'm going to go on too long. But anyway, the long and short of it is the DEI, which you mentioned before, Perry, that's being trying to be eased out, perhaps, you know, brought in an awful lot of people because of ambiguity of language through the southern immigration from France. And I have been there, and several of you have been there. I don't see many women on this broadcast tonight, or this podcast tonight, but you know what? I have been in the subway with some of those, uh, you know, people who take liberties from different cultures, and it is horrible. And let's get back to a real good translation system. You've mentioned measures. Let's, you know, start with cooking or something like that. That's all I can have to say.
Well, I mean, to bridge change sometimes means just getting together. I can recall when the Alberta Council of Technologies was in its early stages, we would do networking events. And one of the powers of networking events was networking, of people who had never met one another before, meeting someone that they would like to meet again, and creating the foundation then for action, for progress. I've often argued that one of the beauties of living in Alberta and having a career in Alberta was it's a relatively young province without a lot of institutional impediments. It's like big fish, little pond. Making change in Alberta was relatively easy in the Lougheed days. You didn't have a lot of institutional rigidities that were trying to protect their domains of power. It's different today. And one of the fundamental issues that the current premier faces is when is it time to make fundamental changes when waiting has become excessive? I argued when I was director of privatization of the province that watch the waiting list. Waiting should be your canary in the mine when it gets excessive. But is 16 hours too long? Surely it is. But if it's only affecting a few people, is it really relevant? Can we tolerate that? At one point, is it intolerable? When the doctors start to speak up that we've got patients that are dying in our waiting rooms, is the voice of the doctor? Well, they argue, oh, the doctor's all about supply. They just want more supply. We can handle that. It's very delicate to be a leader at a time when there is frustration, to know about timing. When is the right time to enter the market? When is the right time to leave the market? When is the right time to make a policy change, etc.? This requires a level of sensitivity, but the one thing it does call for, and this is my fundamental argument for this network, and I guess as Jeff and I have discovered that AI has found in what KEI has been doing and AI before, ABC Tech before it, conversation. Keep the conversation going, because through that we will learn when it's the right time. We will see enough is enough. But when conversation is over, and I think Greg has made that point, that's when you're in trouble, when there is no conversation any longer. Then you're in a totalitarian regime, when people are shooting down the protesters. And I don't mean violent protesters, but people protesting, there's a limit to when it becomes violent. Then it loses its focus, and the issue that gets forgotten. The protest becomes the issue. That is unfortunately what seems to be happening over and over again today, is the pressures have built up to such a point that the protests become violent and you forget the fundamental issue that we really wanted to see addressed. Go ahead, Carol, go ahead.
Harry, I was just writing in a comment in the chat in regards to Greg's comment, and protests do help to raise awareness. It's what happens when they become unruly.
Right.
But would people really truly have to protest if, in fact, they were actually heard and seen to begin with? So, in order for that to happen, through my eyes and my ears and my brain, is that the systems that we have in place really disregard people. People are treated as objects versus being treated as people. And we can talk about that in the healthcare system. We can talk about that in the political system. We can talk about that in the bureaucracy or even in service. The
Yeah,
way people, the way businesses are serving people today. You know, if you're having to wait for 45 minutes or an hour or 2 hours to get a response on the telephone, that's not service. That's, you know, we've just become objects.
Well,
And
the headline there is suppliers are dominating the issues of the consumer.
yeah,
And the role that government is supposed to play in a market-driven economy is to be the regulator to make sure that that does not happen. And to me, the flaw isn't corporations do what corporations do. It's that government is failing in its role as a regulator because it's unpopular.
well, and in some cases, government has become so heavy-handed as a regulator that suppliers are
Well,
handlocked as
sure.
well. So
Sure. Okay.
it's a
So,
mess. It's a mess every
okay.
which way.
But you know, I don't think we can use cleanliness or even-handed as the sole judge about democracy failing or not. Democracy is going to be clumsy because it is a system, not like socialism, that there will be a rule. There's a degree of relativism in democracy that's to be tolerated. That's Alan Bloom's argument is you can get carried away with relativism. Everything has to work. But the point that you're making is when the client, one step above a slave in Roman times, becomes so irrelevant to the system, you got a problem.
Yeah.
And when waiting 16 hours in an ER, you have a problem. That's not hard to acknowledge. Someone has waited too long in order to fix the system when that becomes almost the standard. So I agree with you 100%. Anyone else want to throw in their 2 cents worth on this topic? It's a lively one. We probably can never give it up because it reflects this tension between markets and the public and the person and the consumer. And there's tension in there. And the regulator, often government or the industry itself or a judge, is asked to make a judgment of when is enough and what is the right balance. It's like sailing and getting it right sometimes or all the time. It's never going to be all the time unless you have the power to say, like it or not, this is the way it's going to be. Kevin?
Yeah, couple of points. First of all, we back to the point around protests in the street and whatnot. That's a sign of mass disaffection, and from a political perspective, mass disaffection that is not addressed will ultimately lead to radicalization, revolution, and even terrorism. And there are many examples that are not just the Middle East. Look at Northern Ireland. Look at many places in the world where folks have been, hard done by and have taken to arms. So I think it's wise to recognize protest and to react and to ensure that they are taken seriously. The second thing is around we have this terrific I guess thing in this little group of ours, and we have the ability to have respectful conversation, which is absolutely critical. And I think we would all agree that it's not necessarily common in our society. Our little group and our value of respectful conversation is sadly somewhat unique, and it needs to be. How do we uh, uh, get this value of respectful conversation out into the world, and how and in such a way that it undermines or reduces the binary, the polarization and whatnot. And how do we do it in such? I think one of the reasons that it's difficult to get out there is that the people that are able to participate in respectful conversation are perhaps viewed as an intellectual elite. So how do we engage the general population in a way that's not viewed as elitist, but is viewed as respectful discussion and conversation and sharing of a wide variety of political perspectives?
Well, supposedly, those that have the power of communication, being the media, is one of the outlets for frustration.
Mhm.
But they seem to become politicized, which means they get undervalued as only talking about one side versus both sides.
Mhm.
So the media that we would like to respect is the media that will give you both sides of the story, if you will. Now, I do understand, and I heard this statistic this week, that the percentage of people leaving the Democratic and Republican parties in the US is massive. And the independent is becoming a major force. Now, the independent doesn't have a leader. The independent is made up of individual perspectives. Now, someone will try and take over the leader, over that third party, but the right and the left work very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. That's maybe a interesting sign, and maybe a progressive sign, that people are exercising their personal sovereignty to step back and say, I don't have to be politically correct. I don't have to be right. I don't have to be left. I can be me. And being me is core to an effective democracy.
Mhm.
Jeff and I have been talking about this at great length. It's a product of what we're exploring, of what's been taking place for me personally over the last 20 years, of trying to come to a better understanding of whether or not there was something that I was doing with ABC Tech and with KEI, with the various things that and I say we've been undertaking, or I've been mobilizing, and it seems to have found something, and it's about conversation. And Kevin, without prompting, you echoed that sentiment of the power and the value of conversation in a democracy, of
Mhm.
not necessarily coming up with the answer, but allowing perspectives to take place, which is not just healthy, it's constructive and it's instructive.
Yeah.
But we don't have a lot of those forums. They get politicized, they get owned.
Mhm.
There used to be the commons. The commons wasn't owned. The commons was a ground in a community where people came together and shared. And there was often, I forget what they called the guy on the soapbox that used to.
Mhm.
Kevin, you would know, in London they had one where you have a park and then you have a soapbox that people would speak from.
Speaker's
Uh,
Corner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Speaker's Corner. I mean, where do you find those anymore?
Yeah.
They'd put you in a straitjacket and take you to Alberta Hospital.
Well,
Uh,
the Speaker's Corner is now the social media.
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
Sadly.
Okay, I'm near wrap up. The clock still plays a governing role in my life and in ours. Peter, you want to have the last word? I'd like to ask Jeff to
I,
step in.
I just like to mention, and I mean, I'm sure everybody knows this already, but we're talking about, identity and Canada's position in things. I would suggest that Canada is widely recognized throughout the world, as citizens of Canada are widely recognized throughout the world as being very tolerant and very somewhat humble in the sense of, well, they're very nice, and we always say sorry. So, I mean, there's something in our culture, and no matter whether you're what language you're speaking in this country, but we have that kind of background in our society. And perhaps that's an advantage that we haven't considered in terms of holding us together and something to build on. So I throw that
Well,
out as a
yeah,
concept
I
too.
Peter,
consider.
out of respect, I think we have considered it. I think we do recognize that it is an asset, but at times it can also be a liability because there is a point where waiting intolerance is in fact going to lead you into trouble.
I was
Uh,
referring to the government.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, not
I
they're
hear,
the ones who are doing the waiting. The
I hear.
people are
Yeah.
speaking up.
Well, the tongue-in-cheek, and some of you have heard this. Ken, I'll give you a moment here. I say this tongue-in-cheek, but there's some relevance to it that the most effective defense system in the world is Canada's. Our weather, our wilderness, and our women. Okay, Kevin, your time. Your turn. Go ahead, Ken.
Um, just a comment on this. The topic is the gathering storm, why waiting? I'm thinking about the procurement side. Of course, that's what I do for a living.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of policy going on making sure we do things across Canada. It's not going broadly enough. We need to do more than that. Seriously, we need to stop buying from the US, buy from the rest of our provinces, which supports our country, and then go to Europe or wherever we have to. My point of view from a procurement voice.
Well, Ken, you and I worked on that procurement study some years ago, and we made the
Yeah.
point at that time, and it was agreed upon by both the administrators and by those that use the procurement system that it had become bastardized by those who were using it for social engineering purposes, and we were not getting the best
16,000
value through our
votes
procurement
against it, right? To your point.
Well,
Absolutely.
part of the reason. Oh, sorry, Ken.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean
Go
to.
ahead, Peter. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say part of
You're
the
both
problem,
being
I
too
think.
nice and too Canadian. Now go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I like. Yeah, I agree with you, Ken, about procurement. I think our governments at all levels, municipal, provincial, territorial, and national, fails Canadian industry, particularly startups and mid-sized companies. Not so much startups. I guess that's another issue. Certainly mid-sized companies. They don't procure from us because they're too low. There's a risk factor that are ingrained in our public sector that they will get punished if something goes wrong, so to speak. And so awarding a contract to a company you never heard of before because it's Canadian, and even though it's got a great reputation on the basis of its scale, they don't buy from it. They'll buy from a trusted American name and or other Europe, a foreign name. And so we've got this. I mean, it's a mindset in the public sector and across the country.
But Peter,
It's got to change.
we are talking about a public procurement system.
Yes.
Right.
The public procurement system becomes politicized by ensuring that my politics need to be listened to when we purchase. So you need to buy local and make sure that my interests are met. We have politicized the procurement system that it was reflective of DEI. It was being used as an instrument not to get value of an economic nature, but to achieve a whole bunch of social engineering objectives as well. So one way or another, you got to realize you have put the buying for Canada in the hands of politicians, and should you be surprised? Go ahead, Ken.
I'll give you my point on this because Perry, you and I have talked about this for a while. I brought this up years ago with Tech Invest with an event saying, you know what, we need to bring in this Alberta Advantage. And what I'm talking about is put in qualification for bringing something in Alberta. If you live here, you have a business here, there is value there. We do this all across Canada. If you're if you're in Quebec, you will avoid Canada other than Quebec, which is violating trade law. But they do it anyway. But we are so anti about that. Our procurement rules are about they don't know what they were doing. Now I'm talking years ago and things have changed, but I'm actually in a position now where I'm going to help move that forward where let's bring Alberta into Alberta. Like there's ways like for instance, I bid on a project with Equalit, and 25% of my bid was based on if I had somebody local there. Well, why, this is my point, Perry, earlier about the Alberta Advantage that I think is important. Let's make sure in procurement, if you're in Alberta, you get a voice. There's a position for it. There's nothing against trade law. I'm all about procurement. I've been doing this my whole life. I continue to do it. We can actually do it, but there's people that are fearful because they don't understand it, right?
Well,
So I think we need to go to the lawmakers, and I'm doing this right now, by the way, so you know, I'm actually getting into circles where I'm actually influencing how they want to procure things. Let's make it open to Alberta and have a say. If you're in Alberta, you get higher votes. Bring it in. Like, come on, you companies, bring it into Alberta and start up a company, but you're Albertan now, right?
so Ken,
Right?
we're in a wrap-up mode now, so I'm going to reflect on what you just did,
Sorry.
which was a form of protesting in the course of conversation that became instructional, and 22 people were listening, and you had a protest. You didn't have a sign. You didn't exercise violence. It was logical. You may have even introduced an element of emotion to it, a point that was made earlier by one of the one of our viewers, that to win an argument isn't just to be logical. As Gabe Shelley shared with me, the most sensitive part of the anatomy needs to be pinched before you make change.
Uh-huh.
And that isn't the brain, that's the pocketbook. But change does not come about simply through logic, or our institutions and socialism would win. You've got to appeal to the emotional element of a society and an individual as well. And therein lies that dilemma, is how to bridge what may be logical with what is emotionally resonating. And therein lies one of the challenges that leadership has, is to be in touch with people, not just intellectually, but emotionally as well. And I'm going to leave it at that. I thought that was
Well, Todd had a comment.
I thought that was fucking brilliant.
Yeah, thank you, Todd, you have a
Okay.
comment.
Peter, thank you. Randall,
Thank you for asking, Perry.
Randall,
It was a short notice, and I hope I was able to communicate at least a few personal thoughts that
I
made
think
sense.
it was rich. I mean, I don't have Arcos with me. I put him in the other room, but I enjoyed this conversation immensely, and I think it was insightful. It didn't go exactly where I expected, which was good. It was the conversation took us like sailing. The wind blew in many different directions, and hopefully we covered them all. So